Good morning. New tournament, new set of videos. Welcome to round one of the Menorca Open 2025. This is one of the stronger opens, maybe even strongest opens of the year, or at least of the open tournaments that I can reasonably participate in. I think I was coming into this tournament somewhere around the 100th seed, which is partially a reflection of how, low my rating has fallen, but also just a reflection of how unbelievably strong this tournament is. This is not something that probably would ever happen in the US. I can't remember the last time I was even like the 50th seed in a tournament, let alone as far down as 100. So it was a very exciting experience to sort of relive this era that has kind of been long past for me for a very, very long time, where I am one of the lower rated players in the event, if anything. Like, there's really no expectations, no pressure. I'm absolutely not going to be winning the event. There's really nothing to play for other than just having fun, trying to have some good results, getting a chance to play some of the really top players in the world. And I was definitely looking forward to that. It's been a long time since I've gotten to have an experience like that. But in order to get there, we do have to get through the first round, in which we were playing against a local Spanish player, around 2,000 rated. And especially after the previous event, I decided to sort of change my strategy quite a bit when playing the early rounds of these open events against lower rated opposition. Previously, I've generally been trying to focus on playing main lines, just sticking to my opening repertoire, not really being scared of my opponent's opening knowledge, basically arguing like, okay, if a 1900, if a 2000, a 2100, like if they're beating me in the opening, that's a problem. That shouldn't happen. And I really shouldn't be scared of it happening. Like that's something that I should just solve, rather than trying to avoid the situation altogether. But while I still believe that to some extent in the short term, especially again, the previous event had gone pretty poorly, partially because of that philosophy where I was getting very, very bad positions out of the opening in almost every game. There was no time to kind of repair that. This tournament began not quite less than, I guess, like exactly one day after the previous one. So at least for a short term, I decided to go with a completely different approach, not worry too much about the objective evaluations of openings, play something dubious, just get them out of theory, and hope to outplay them later on in the middle game. And with that in mind, I decided to begin my first round of the tournament by playing the move G3. Obviously, it's not one of the most challenging moves. It's not bad, but it's strictly worse than knight f3 in a lot of ways. Typically, there's a lot of transpositional possibilities, but because we're starting with G3, we're not immediately impacting the center. We're offering black the opportunity to play e5, which is something that would not be available if we started with one knight f3, which is a much more respectable sort of opening move. The only reason to play g3 instead of knight f3 is that after bishop g2, our bishop is a little bit immediately active, and specifically the bishop on g2 can support the move e4. So g3 is a way to get specifically King's Indian players a little bit out of their comfort zone, and specifically King's Indian players who don't play anything else. They're, kind of one-tricking their one opening, because if black autopilots the sort of King's Indian move order with knight f6, bishop g2, g6, now if we play knight f3, obviously we transpose back into some King's Indian lines, but white has the additional option of playing the move e4, which leads to a very, very different type of position. After bishop g7, we could, of course, play like c4 and d4 and go back into the King's Indian, but after d4, let's say d6, knight to c3, we also have the option of entering a not particularly challenging response to the Pyrrhic defense. So g3 is not one of white's better responses. But if black is somebody who plays King's Indian and not the Pyrrhic, this is going to be a little bit out of their preparation for sure, and something that could be very, very unpleasant for this type of player to face. So I did notice before the game that my opponent was a King's Indian player, and he was not a Pyrrhic player. He plays mostly the French against e4, which is especially an opening that I don't want to get involved in against a much lower rated player. Against a slightly lower rated player, I think it's fine. But against a much lower rated player, like the French is definitely something where you can kind of be asking for trouble, because the ways to beat the French are very risky and strategically complex. It's very easy to go wrong. So I didn't really want to get into that kind of theoretical discussion, and I don't really play much d4. I mean, I know some stuff against the King's Indian, I have some ideas, but they're not very serious, and also not something that should really be used in this particular tournament situation. So I figured that this would be a good time to trot out g3. We have the right player for it. Again, King's Indian player, not a Pyrrhic player. And I was hoping to just throw my opponent off, even though objectively, obviously, g3 is not even a real move. I wouldn't even say like good move. So my opponent started with knight f6, and after bishop g2, here he probably smelled a rat and realized that after g6 I was intending to play e4, which he didn't know how to deal with, because he actually spent quite some time in this position and then eventually decided to play the move e5, which is the most principled, I think. Again, this is an option that is available to black only because we haven't played the move knight to f3, so it's trying to exploit white's move order, which makes a lot of sense. Well, white has a few ways to try to deal with this. It's possible to play e4 anyway. This is certainly a line, and one that I did consider very briefly. The idea here is to sort of play this as if it's like a Philidor almost, like we're going to follow up with knight c3, knight e2, and d4. We can even transpose back into some Pyrrhic type positions if black just goes for g6 and bishop g7 anyway. But with black not committed to g6, I think this is a little bit odd. Black can just follow up with, for example, bishop to c5, which makes it a little bit harder to get the d4 move in. For example, knight e2, knight c6, black has very, very good control over this square, which means we'll eventually probably need to play something like c3 to prepare d4, and then it starts to look a little bit bizarre. We're playing almost a reverse Pyrrhic at that point with the white pieces, but in a kind of odd configuration. I wouldn't mind playing the Pyrrhic reversed normally, but with this configuration, it's not quite ideal, I don't think. So e4 is certainly viable, but the most natural move is to sort of transpose back into the English variation, or the English opening rather, with c4, which I expected my opponent, once again, not to be super familiar with, because since they play the King's Indian defense almost exclusively, if I had started with c4 on move 1, they most likely would have gone for either g6 or knight f6 and then g6, and not the move e5. So I played c4 and my opponent played c6, which is also a very principled way of meeting this sort of English variation, just intending to take full control of the center with d5, but it's a line that does require some knowledge in order to play. And I suspected, again, probably, at this point, not just because of my pregame preparation, where I knew that this wasn't the type of position that my opponent was 100% comfortable with, but also his time usage at this point. We're only on move 3, and my opponent had already invested something like 20 minutes into the position. So I suspected that he probably wasn't familiar with the tactical justifications behind this line. And so at this point, white has the option of a few different moves. Even, once again, e4 is viable. But the most principled is to exploit the fact that the knight can no longer travel to c6 and play d4. Black is basically required to play e4. If black takes, it's kind of legal, I guess. But white has definitely achieved something because the queen is very, very well placed on d4 since it can't be harassed. This is definitely a good outcome of the opening. So e4 is the principled approach. And now white has two ways to play the position. One is to play this sort of reverse French style, trying to put pressure on the e4 and later d5 pawns, because black will probably play d5 in a very French style. Probably put the knight on c3, maybe bring the other knight to f4, for example. We'll probably play bishop g5 and trade off this bishop. This is sort of the equivalent of the bad French bishop on the other side. Or to play the move d5, trying to prevent black from playing d5 himself. This is also a very viable way of playing with its own set of theory, and probably is the better move, objectively. I think under normal circumstances, I probably would have played d5 against an opponent that if I thought my opponent knew this position, or it was a little bit better prepared, I probably would go d5. But again, trying to play the fact that I didn't think my opponent would know all of the details in the knight c3 line, I decided to go for this. even though objectively I think this actually even gives black a bit of an advantage. My opponent played d5, takes bishop g5, and here is, I guess, the first moment where it's very important for black to actually know some concrete stuff. It's useful to compare this to, I think, the line in the hyper-accelerated dragon for white. After knight f3, g6, c3, bishop g7, takes, d5, e5, and now, for example, bishop to g4. We reach a very, very, very similar position with colors reversed to the position in the game after bishop to g5. The difference here is that black basically already has the knight on c6 in this position. It would be the equivalent. Like, if black got to play knight c6 for free, we would reach the position in the game with reverse colors. Now, it turns out this line has a very bad reputation for black. It's a very, very serious advantage for white. If we flick on the engine, it's gonna say something like +1. Yeah, plus 0.8, plus 0.9. Like a very, very serious advantage for being on move 6. And white wins like almost every game. The structure is just so really, really bad for black. And so even, the structure is so bad that even if black did have the move knight to c6 for free, black is actually still worse. And so if we compare that to this position, once again, black is actually still, white now, white is still worse, even though he has this extra move in, or at the very best has no advantage. So this is like a real gamble that we're taking with the white pieces. We're gifting black a better position as early as move 7, with the idea that, okay, our opponent's probably not going to know how to manage this position super easily. Now, there's a sort of concrete points here that I guess need to be understood. First of all, we are threatening to take on f6 and go ahead and take this pawn on d5. That much is probably pretty clear. And so black does need to defend against this threat. My opponent chose to move bishop to b4, which is a very reasonable way of dealing with it, but not the strongest. The actual way to, or best move for black here is, again, if we go back to the position with the white side, in this position, white generally plays the move knight d2, or plays the move check first, takes, and then knight d2. And the point is that this both shores up the knight on f3, so that if black does take, we can consider taking with the knight, but it's also aiming for the b3 square, where it will restrict this pawn very, very heavily, and this backwards pawn becomes a very, very, very serious weakness. So the knight, it's very important for white to understand in this line that the knight belongs on d2 and not on c3. Because on c3, it's staring into nothing. The pawn on c6 actually controls it very, very well. And if white doesn't go for bishop e5, then it's not really clear why black should be worse. This structural disadvantage is the important thing for the white pieces generally. But even if the knight were already on c6, white would still prefer the knight to be on b3. It defends the pawn on d4, which is very important because black's counterplay is centered entirely around putting pressure on the base of the pawn chain here. It also does eye the c5 square, which even if there's not a pawn here, is just a very good square for the knight in general. And on c3, the knight does comparatively nothing. We put no pressure on d5. Realistically, black is going to play e6 at some point anyway. We're not really going to b5 ever. Even if we were, black is probably playing a6 to prevent the bishop from coming to b5 anyway. So by putting the knight on c3, we make a6 even more effective. And so it's very important to understand that the knight belongs here. If we look at this from the black side, the equivalent would be the knight coming to d7, intending to go to b6. So by far the most natural move in this position for the black side would be to play knight d7. This defends against the threat of taking on a6. Again, black is now happy to take with the knight, defend the pawn, and now black just has the advantage of the two bishops for free. So the question is, okay, can black tactically justify this move knight to d7? There is a pin. Can we take this pawn? Turns out, of course, the answer is no. Black has a very simple solution, playing queen a5 with a very typical fork of the king and the knight. Normally this wouldn't be a problem, because white would just slide back with the knight, blocking the check and keeping the knight protected, but the queen is also indirectly hitting the bishop from across the board, and black emerges up a clear piece. So we're unable to take on d5 with the white pieces, which means either we need to play like a normal move, like knight h3 or something, intending to castle, after which black is very, very happy with his setup, or we need to do something immediate, which would most naturally be this move queen to a4, reintroducing the threat of taking on d5 in multiple ways. First of all, we're threatening to just take it directly now, because queen a5 is no longer a move. The queen on a4 defends it. But we're also threatening to take on f6, which would force black to take back with either the queen or the pawn because the knight is pinned, and then we can safely take on d5 again since the defender of the pawn has been removed. So black needs to find a solution to this, and it's not that simple. The only move, but a very, very powerful one, is to initiate a counterattack by playing the move queen to b6, taking advantage of the fact that the pawn on b2 has been left completely undefended. And now if we take on f6, which would be white's general idea, again removing the defender of d5, black doesn't take back, which would allow white to just grab the pawn, but instead continues the counterattack, and now all of white's pieces are hanging, which is a very, very, very serious problem. So white is not really able to take on f6. White instead needs to deal with this threat, and the time gained by white having to waste a move to defend this pawn gives black the opportunity to just develop very, very naturally. Bishop d6, bishop e7, whatever. Castle's next move. You can even play h6 to force the bishops off. Either way. Black is doing very, very well. But if you don't know this move, queen b6, which is not the easiest to find over the board, then bishop b4 is kind of the obvious fallback. This, again, back in this position, white was playing the move bishop to b5 pretty often in these lines, so bishop b4 from the other side makes a lot of sense as well. Now the main difference for white, and the reason that this line is even playable at all, is that if we again played a normal move, let's say knight h3, then black would be able to take, play knight d7, and this pawn again becomes very weak in the same way that it would in this position. Here the c6 pawn is a very, very big problem for black. In this position, the c3 pawn would be a very, very big problem for white. So since we already have the knight out, we're able to at least keep the structure intact with this move rook to c1. Now if black takes, we're just going to take back with the rook and be fine. Black went ahead and castled, and here I played probably a pretty silly move in a3. I figured, let's just get the bishop off, why not? But the reality is that this bishop is probably going to have to take on c3 somewhat unprompted anyway at some stage. Like, we're most likely going to be playing something like e3, knight e2, knight f4, putting a lot of pressure on d5, probably playing queen b3 as well to add additional pressure not just to this pawn but also to this bishop. So there's probably naturally going to build up enough pressure against this bishop anyway that we don't really need to force it to take on c3. It's gonna do that regardless. And so a3 is kind of a waste of a move, I think. I think it was probably better to just start with e3 or knight h3. Just continuing the plan normally and trusting that this bishop will not be around forever. But I wanted to make sure that we got the bishop off immediately because I was a little bit concerned that, okay, maybe it would come back and we wouldn't get our two bishop advantage, which is not a lot, but it's something that resembles an imbalance. My opponent went ahead and took, and after h6 I started to realize here that actually we're not really getting our advantage of the two bishops at all, because if we do slide back with the bishop, maybe to f4 or all the way back to c1, it's not really clear that this bishop is participating in the game. Again, this is sort of the equivalent of the bad French bishop after we play e3 eventually. And so even though, like, if we went back to c1, like, there is a very slow route for the bishop to get back into the game. On the queen side, if we push the pawns, for example, to a4 and b5, we can get the bishop to a3 where it will participate, but it's very, very slow. And in the meantime, black has a lot of opportunity to pursue his own plans. So I decided that I actually spent quite a bit of time here because I did very heavily consider a move like bishop c1 or bishop to d2 anyway. Just trying to play the very, very, very long game. But eventually I decided that it was probably just too dangerous, and I went ahead and took the knight, which is not bad. We are getting rid of our bad bishop in exchange for a knight that is kind of important to black's position. It is the best kind of defender of the center right now. So we're not like particularly upset with the exchange or anything. It's just a question of whether we're leaving enough firepower on the board to have an advantage at any point later on. So my opponent took back, of course. We played the move e3. Again, we're just intending to complete our development, bring the knight to e2, and then eventually f4 and castle and kingside. Opponent played knight c6, and here I decided to begin with move queen b3. I'm not sure if it was necessary, but I wanted to avoid any problems with after knight e2, bishop g4, and then after castle, for example, bishop f3. I just wanted to make sure that we weren't going too crazy on the trades. In general, I think white should be happy to trade pieces because this pawn becomes very, very weak, and the fewer pieces that are on the board, the harder it is to defend it. We also have control of this file. Our queen's going to be a little bit easier to make use of. So it's not like that big a deal to trade minor pieces. In general, I think it's fine. But I do want to avoid, I did want to make sure I was avoiding a situation where we do go into an endgame that's very unpleasant for black to hold because, you know, the few pieces that he has remaining become very, very passive, but there's just not enough firepower to actually win the game because there's only one weakness. You know, black does have a very glaring weakness, but it's only one weakness. And there's a very high possibility that black can just like put a knight on e7, put his rooks on d8 and d7, and just turtle forever. And white does not actually have enough of a way in. So I decided to play queen b3 just to try to preserve some pieces on the board. My opponent played knight e7, which I thought was a bit of an odd way to defend the pawn, but probably fine. Knight e2, bishop g4, knight f4, rook d8. So far, all of this I think is pretty normal. You know, white is trying to organize pressure against d5. Black is trying to organize a defensive d5, even if it's a little bit awkward. We can't really grab this pawn immediately because black will get a lot of counterplay and our king starts to feel very unsafe. So I decided to resolve the situation. The bishop is actually quite well placed on g4. Decided to just kick it back, expecting a move like bishop to e6 or bishop to f5. But here, possibly because my opponent had spent like a lot of time. Again, you know, the gamble of this opening was not so much that we were expecting to get any big advantage out of the opening, or really any advantage out of the opening. This position is probably still very, very close to equal, if not even, but black even, well, probably at this point I don't think black can be better. I think white probably has a very, very tiny advantage, but nothing significant. But the gamble is that this was just a position that my opponent would have trouble handling because he's not used to it. It's just not his style of position. And that was borne out by the fact that by this point, my opponent is actually already in very, very heavy time pressure. This is a 90-30 game. There's no extra time coming at move 40 or anything. So, you know, the time you have is the time you have for the rest of the game, besides the 30-second increment. And at this point, just like 15 moves into the game, my opponent was already down to something like 20 minutes. So I was very, very confident at this point that we would manage to at least generate chances. I didn't think like, okay, I wasn't like, okay, we've won the game or anything. But I thought there was going to come a point where black needed to make some kind of decision. And he wouldn't have enough time to do it. I didn't expect it to be this early. But after h3, my opponent played a very, very, I would say, strategic blunder, really. It's not really like an inaccuracy, like it's actually very, very bad, which was this move bishop f3. I think this is, practically speaking, just losing the game on the spot. I definitely understand the instinct because, you know, again, my opponent had pretty low time. Not like critically low time, but low enough time that it was going to be relevant at some point in the game. And if black slides back with something like, you know, bishop f5, for example, he's in for kind of an annoying defense. Like, white's plan is very straightforward. I'm going to castle, double on the c file, play rook c5 to put more pressure on d5. Eventually we'll play f3 to open up this bishop and put even more pressure on d5. And black's going to have to be dealing with all of these threats for the rest of the game. You know, he's going to have to be trying to organize a defense of this d5 pawn in a way that doesn't make him passive enough that we can like take b7, for example, or invade with rook c7, or maybe even start playing with something like g4, trying to really harass this bishop and starting some, you know, fireworks on the f file. there's a lot for black that's going to have to consider from a practical perspective, and so even though like I'm sure my opponent knew that bishop f3 was probably bad, it's understandable to just basically say like, okay, if I play bishop f5, I'll probably lose eventually. It'll be slow and painful, but I'll probably lose. Bishop f3, maybe I'll lose. Even like very likely I'll lose. But at least like I'm giving myself the opportunity to go down swinging, and I'm giving my opponent an opportunity to, or at least maybe a better way of putting it is like I'm constructing a position where the time disadvantage is not the problem; it's a position disadvantage. I have the time to figure out something if my opponent makes a mistake, so it's on my opponent to just not make a mistake for the rest of the game. So I imagine that was the intent here. I respect the gamble, but positionally speaking, this is really bad. This pawn on f3 looks powerful, and it looks like it's generating a lot of threats against white's king, but it's also very, very difficult for black to support. We could, for example, even go after it immediately with queen d1, and it's very, very unpleasant to defend already. Black basically has to play g5 to kick the knight and reintroduce the defense of the pawn with the queen, but g5 is a very weakening move. It's already quite dangerous for black to open the king like that, and also it's a very temporary measure. For example, after queen d1, this is one of the lines I was calculating, g5, knight h5. We're still attacking this pawn, so black's only way to defend the pawn is to put the queen on f5. Now after g4, once again, the queen needs to maintain contact with the pawn. The only square to do that is e4. But after the simple knight g3, now the queen is no longer able to hold this pawn together. White is just going to pick it up and probably win the game immediately. Once this pawn falls, the rest of the position kind of collapses with it. It's not just the one pawn. The reason I rejected queen d1 is that, very simply, we're not actually threatening this pawn immediately because of the g5 idea. So black can play like a simpler move, like, I don't know, rook c8, for example. And now if we take, then black has g5 with a pin, which is very, very annoying. We can play like queen g4 to try to counter pin of our own, but it's just unnecessarily complicated when we have simpler options, which I decided to just go ahead and castle. This might look like a little bit of a surprising move, especially when I said especially when I just said I didn't want to allow complications, because we are castling into a little bit of an attack. This pawn on f3 does at least, I mean, it is at least by my king, so it generates some kind of an annoyance. If this knight gets like super far away, then black will at least have the idea of trying to sneak the queen into white's position, deliver a mate on g2 or something. But it's not that difficult to calculate that it's really hard for black to actually do that. Black is basically attacking with one piece, just the queen itself. None of these pieces are contributing to any kind of attack, nor do they have any real avenue into it. It's going to take a lot of moves for black to generate any kind of maneuver of any of these pieces over to the king side. And in the meantime, this construction is really quite solid for white. If white puts the king on h2, for example, there's really no way to generate any pressure on the h3 pawn, much less get a queen to like g2 or something. Black would have to spend many, many moves playing like rook d6 to g6 to g5 to h5. It's like 4 moves invested to make one threat. So the king is actually quite safe where it is on g1, even though it might look like this pawn is very, very, very scary. And it's important to get the second rook into the game. This is, before castles, this is the last piece that doesn't have a role. The knight is quite well placed here, it puts pressure on d5, it restricts the queen. The queen is quite well placed here, it puts pressure on these very critical pawns. This rook is very well placed, it controls the open file. This rook is the only piece that still needs a role in the position. And so castle is intending to just double on the c file and give it a bit of a job. My opponent played g5, just trying to kick off the very, very good knight, which makes sense. Slid back to d3. There's also the option of going to h5, again with this idea of g4 opening up a home for on g3, where it would also be very well placed. But I just didn't, I didn't see like that much of a concrete problem with it. There is some stuff to calculate with f5, and then the king side is starting to become like a very serious liability. But even on general grounds, there's just, I thought, no reason to further weaken my kingside when we have a perfectly reasonable alternative. The knight would also be very well placed, for example, on e5, so we can head there. And if we take care of the kingside, it would be very well placed on c5 as well. So the knight on d3 is actually doing a very, very nice job. Plus it has a defensive purpose, as we'll see later. If black somehow gets a queen to like h3 or something, we can at least defend checkmate by putting the knight on e1. My opponent played rook c8. I think this is pretty mandatory. He's got to activate, same way we needed to activate our rook, he needs to get this rook into the game somehow. But this does allow me to just go ahead and tactically go ahead and take the pawn on b7. Another point of the knight on d3, really every square that I can go to is kind of relevant. It would be very well placed on e5. It would be very well placed on c5. It would do a very nice defensive job on e1. It actually defends the f2 pawn, which isn't really that important, but could be in the future. And also importantly, it defends the b2 pawn, which means that this rook is not capable of sliding into the game so easily. So rook to c8, of course, I'm sure my opponent was aware that I can grab this pawn. This was an intentional pawn sacrifice. But the point, his idea, sorry, still working off this cold. His idea was that he can now bring the other rook to c8 and try to generate counterplay this way. For example, if we had to play like an ugly looking move like rook to c1, now black has some ideas like queen f5, trying to get the queen into the position one way or another and generate some very, very annoying counterplay. But fortunately, it turns out, once again, like I said, the kingside might look scary for white, but there's really no way in for black. So this knight is not needed in the defense just yet. And so we can go ahead and actually activate it, put it on active square rather than, it is very well placed on d3 in the sense that it has a lot of useful places it can go to, but on d3 it is not itself useful just yet. It does need to actually go to one of those places to be useful. And c5 is a very clear one of them. We now completely restrict the rook from entering the game. And the knight on c5, even though it doesn't look like it's controlling like important squares here, these are all just kind of squares. It does have a role that we'll see momentarily. And again, if black drives for something like queen f5, we can very comfortably defend the king side by ourselves, essentially. It doesn't need any additional support with something simple like king h2. So my opponent instead tried to continue to break down the structure with h5. This makes sense. If black isn't going to be able to break this structure, then he's got to compromise it first before trying to bring more pieces into it. But the other point of the knight going to c5 is now we're able to blow open the center with e4, activating all of the pieces. Even in a position like this, it's a weird position, for sure. White is up a pawn for what black hopes is compensation. Whether the compensation is real or not is a different question, but it is sort of a position where black has sacrificed a pawn for a quote-unquote attack, and white is trying to defend. It's also a very weird structure because there's a pawn on f3, which is very, very unusual. But nevertheless, the principles of chess still sort of apply. And with black starting a wing action, the natural reaction of trying to respond in the center still exists. Nothing has really changed. Now, there are concrete points of it as well. That's sort of a side effect. Like, all these maximums have side effects. We're not just like striking the center because for fun, or because like some old saying told us to. Like, the maxim is telling us to consider striking the center because there's probably like a good reason to do it. And in this case, there's a very good reason to do it, which is that we're actually threatening to play e5, harassing the queen, and the queen will actually have nowhere to go that maintains the defense of the knight. The knight also can't move out of the way because the knight is forced to defend the rook. So this whole configuration of this queen defends the knight, defends the rook is actually very unstable. And if we're able to disrupt it, then black's position completely collapses even more than it already has. This is again another point of knight to c5 as we're controlling the e6 square, which would otherwise be a very comfortable home for the queen. And for that reason, with this e5 threat looming, I mean, obviously we're also threatening to just take this pawn on d5 for free. my opponent decided to go ahead and take on e4. This is, again, a point on knight c5. Now we can take back with the knight. This pretty much forces black to start trying to enter the game with the queen. If black went for queen e6 with a similar idea of attacking h3 but keeping the pawn defended, or keeping the knight defended, this, unfortunately for black, loses defense of the pawn, which also defends black's entryway into white's king position. So this knight has taken quite a journey. It's been very useful on d3, it's been very useful on c5, it's been very useful on e4, but it is most useful on g5, where we've taken not just one pawn, but also two, coming very quickly, and completely decimated any chance black has of an attack. So this would straight up end the game. So queen f5 is kind of the only practical try remaining, even though it's not defending the e7 knight anymore. It's a full piece sacrifice, which we can very comfortably take, because after queen h3, it looks like, oh no, we've wandered queen g2 mate. Maybe we don't actually have anything better than like some kind of perpetual. Well, okay, not here because we'd have mate, but like maybe we don't have. Maybe we just have to take perpetual here. How are we gonna stop this very, very powerful mate? But I found before entering this line, of course, a nice way of ending the game. There are other ways too. We can go ahead and take this pawn, for example, and then give a bunch of checks that end on the f file and just go collect f3. But I think the much more stylish way to end the game is the nice move that I found here, which is to sacrifice our queen with queen takes f7. Now black is pretty much forced to take. If black slides the king over, then among other things, we can just go ahead and take on f3. And after black takes, we are once again bringing the knight to its promised land of g5, where we recover our queen with the fork, and we are left with an overwhelming material advantage in the endgame. So a nice way to finish off the first game. I think overall, it's kind of hard for me to say, like, was this a well-played game? Am I happy with it? Because there wasn't much game played, honestly. I just kind of played my moves. A3, I guess, probably was the one inaccuracy of the game. But other than that, all of White's moves are pretty automatic. Just not really a lot to talk about. Normally, I would be showing, like, more complicated lines or, like, other alternatives that I was considering, but there really was no, like, choice along the way. Every move that I played, I think, is not, like, forced, obviously, but it's kind of the only reasonable move to play. And it just kind of worked out because my opponent, again, was unfamiliar with the opening, had to spend a lot of time, and that culminated in this kind of, let's say, desperate lashing out with bishop f3, after which the conversion was, I think, pretty smooth on my part. So I was reasonably happy. I mean, obviously, I'm always happy to get for round one of a tournament. It's not something that happens all the time, so getting it out of the way is definitely good, especially an event this strong where it would really suck to like come to an event like this where there are these many legendary players, like all of these really people that all of these people that would be really cool to even play, let alone score a result against. It's cool even to be in the same room as a lot of these people, to be honest. So it would really suck to come to an event like that and then just be struggling on the bottom boards like the entire way, which is kind of what happened in Alicante, to be honest, which was less bad because that was at least a little bit more minor of an event. But it would be sort of doubly disappointing to do that here. So I was very happy to avoid that problem, at least for a round. So what I didn't know was whether I would be playing up or down in the second round, which is a question that I almost never have to ask myself. It's very unusual that there's even a possibility of playing up in the second round. So that was also like a cool, I was happy to have that experience as early as round two. But we will talk more about that next time when I come back for round two of the Menorca Open, which, spoiler, will be a very exciting opponent. For now, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time for round two.